Greetings from the American University in Cairo and a warm welcome to this webinar of the Gerhardt Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor Sanchita Banjari Saxena, and the title of her webinar is Business and Labor Rights in Global Supply Chains. I am Amal Muafi, the Chief of Party of USAID Scholars Activity implemented by the American University in Cairo, and it's a distinct honor and great pleasure to moderate this webinar. Allow me first to introduce our speaker, who is a researcher working at the intersection of social science, public policy, and business and human rights. She's currently the Executive Director of the Institute for South Asia Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Director of the Sabir and Malani Chaudhry Center for Bangladesh Studies under the Institute. She's also a lecturer of responsible business at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Saxena is the editor of Labor, Global Supply Chains and the Garment Industry in South Asia, Bangladesh After Rana Plaza, as well as the author of Made in Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka, the labor behind the global garments and textile industries. She serves on the editorial board of the Bristol UP series on business, finance, and international development. She has been a practitioner, resident at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy, and a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. She's currently a non-resident research fellow at the Institute of Human Rights and Business and serves on the Barack U.S. Advisory Council and is a member of the Research Network on Sustainable Global Supply Chains. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Sanchita to talk us through the webinar today. And after that, I'll be coming in to moderate the session and receive your questions and comments. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for the invitation. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so everyone can see my presentation. Looks fine. Great. Well, thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here. I will speak for about half an hour, and then I look forward to your questions. So the title of my talk today is Business and Labor Rights in Global Supply Chains. I'll be taking a lot of examples from South Asia, in particular in Bangladesh, and talking about some of the key aspects of business and labor issues, and using the Rana Plaza disaster as an example, as well as kind of bringing in the current COVID-19 crisis. So global supply chains, I will sort of argue, are actually inherently detrimental to good labor rights. The way that supply chains are structured in and of itself, they make pursuing good labor rights and good human rights difficult. And that is because some of the characteristics that are inherent to global supply chains, lack of information, lack of accountability, lack of transparency, hyperflexibility, and unequal power relationships are all necessary for global supply chains to work the way they're supposed to. But these characteristics in and of themselves are extremely detrimental to labor rights and good human rights. What has happened over the decades is we've seen what is sort of called a fragmentation of work. So because it is unclear now, because of the system, the larger global supply chain structure, it is very unclear who is your worker. Is your worker the person who works, for directly at your store, in your company, in your country, or what about in a factory in another country far away? Is that person still your worker? And then who is your employer? Is it your direct supervisor, your direct manager, the factory owner? Is it the CEO and president of the multinational company? Where are they based? So this has made work and the concept of work very murky and very difficult to actually hold anyone accountable for difficulties. in supply chains. So it's very unclear who is responsible, who is not, because it's very easy to say, well, that person is really not my worker. They are so far away. I don't see them. I don't interact with them. Can they really, am I really responsible for them? So over the years, over the decades, there's a lot of information about this, but just I want to go through some of this very quickly. There's been a lot of private regulation trying to deal with the issue of upholding good labor rights. So we see, for example, there's corporate codes of conduct. These, most multinational corporations require their suppliers all over the world to sign on to certain standards that would guarantee good labor rights and good labor practices in these companies, in these factories overseas. There are all sorts of monitoring programs that take place where factories are inspected and assessed, and to make sure suppliers are in compliance. There are certification mechanisms. Products are labeled as sweat-free, fair trade. Sri Lanka has their whole garments without guilt. These are types of ways to signal to the consumer that, yes, these products are made in conditions that are upholding what we consider to be good labor rights. But we know that over the decades, at the same time, there have been a lot of programs in place. There is a lot of effort and energy made, put towards compliance. However, the reality of compliance programs is that it's actually the impact of these programs have been very limited. So you almost see what is called sort of a ritual of compliance. So kind of going through the motions of trying to make sure that the suppliers are compliant. But the reality is there's often incomplete information that's generated by audits, and the incentive structure around these private initiatives are often flawed. So for example, the sort of the quote unquote good suppliers, the ones who are actually trying to do better, there's not really a reward built into the system, in the sense that if they are upholding certain, good labor practices, it's not that they're necessarily getting more business or they're getting higher costs for their products. And the flip side of that is those who don't do as well, those who are making clear violations, unless they're extremely egregious and they've gotten a lot of international press, typically those suppliers, they continue to work with those suppliers as well. So the incentive structure is not very, it's flawed. It does not really push sort of good behavior, push towards good behavior, or actually punish bad behavior. And of course, as with anything over the decades, social auditing itself has become, an $80 billion industry. Hundreds of thousands of audits are conducted on behalf of firms and multi-stakeholders. But again, a lot of the impact that we've seen, if we look at the data on labor rights and labor issues, we see very limited progress that's been made. And the other aspect is that when we look at who needs to make the change, so this whole concept of this idea about accountability, we tend to focus on the suppliers in the global south. So typically Northern brands will dictate how the factory owners, what they need to do, what, sometimes even the government should do, how they should improve conditions in a factory. Brands that will try to, play sort of a policing type of, they have sort of a policing type of relationship with their factories. And the research in this area and policy discussions always tend to, for the most part till now, have concentrated on what supplier countries and suppliers themselves can do and should do to address poor labor conditions and whether these programs are effective or not. So the onus of change has always been on the global south suppliers. Now, of course, most of you will remember in 2013, we had one of the worst industrial disasters ever to take place, which was the collapse of the 8-story Rana Plaza building outside of Dhaka in Bangladesh. And more than 1,000 workers, were killed. Several thousand were injured and left permanently disabled. And this was one of the first times when there was a very clear link and a clear association between brands and a disaster such as this that violated labor rights and human rights to an incredible extent. And part of the reason is that around this time, there was, social media had already become very, very, very popular. And so when there were actual images of tags from the various brands being pulled out of the rubble of this horrific collapse, that in people's minds started to actually make that association that these corporate, these global retailers, these corporate retailers were somehow linked to this egregious violation of labor rights. And so following Rana Plaza, there was, two big organizations that were put in place, the Accord and the Alliance. And without getting into more detail, basically, these groups spent a lot of time trying to improve factory safety. So that the thought was that, a building like this certainly should not have collapsed. And both groups were really spending a lot of time trying to improve the structural issues. So there was a lot of emphasis on the the physical building, fire safety, and electrical safety. And there was a whole long list of sort of checking the box types of monitoring that was taking place. So after Rana Plaza, there was a lot of emphasis on going to the registered factories and basically checking off these long lists of compliance measures. And again, very much focused on structure, electrical, fire safety. And it's certainly it was very important because many of these factories had not been compliant, which is in and of itself rather shocking that after 4 decades of this industry in Bangladesh that's really had been flourishing, that impacted the GDP over so many decades, that there yet were so many factories that still did not meet basic requirements, which is rather shocking in and of itself. But of course, there was a lot of, part of it, while this was a great initiative and a great start, it's still quite limited in what it's able to do. So an example is that factories that were covered were only the registered official factories covered under the private sector organization, the BGMEA and the BKMEA. These are private sector organizations that focus on the registered exporting factories. But of course, you have factories, and this is not a factory. This is actually, maybe a basement somewhere that looks like this. Something like this, a situation like this, is not covered under neither the Accord nor the Alliance. And you can imagine what types of labor violations are taking place in a setting like this. Whether they're getting decent wages, there is probably child labor, there is definitely overtime. And lack of so many other things. So the fear of, there was a lot of worry after Rana Plaza that something like this should never happen again, something so dramatic and so horrific. But at the same time, if we were only focusing on these official registered factories and these types of, situations, the sort of the subcontracting, whether it's in a basement somewhere, if these are left out and if there's absolutely no oversight or management, then the likelihood of another large scale disaster, it certainly is possible. And the other important thing is that, there was the intense focus on the failed building itself. So the building itself collapsed. And that was seen as the main cause and sort of the culprit of the disaster, but it put the focus very narrowly on factory safety and defined factory safety as structural, rather than looking at these broader issues around workers' health and unsafe conditions and difficult difficulty in making ends meet. The definition of safety post Rana Plaza became one that was extremely narrow. And then the question became, at this time, there was a refrain from the business sector to say, no, there is no more business as usual. We cannot continue business as usual because, of course, they don't want, no business, no brand, no company wants to be associated with such a terrible disaster, especially one where it received international attention and international condemnation. But yet we know from some of the data immediately following Rana Plaza that came out, this is 2018 data, so 5 years later, this is Mark Anner, some of his research that really looks at, the prices that were paid to suppliers had actually declined by 13%, lead times had declined by 8%, wages had dropped by 6%, and actually, specifically with Bangladeshi suppliers, profit margins had decreased by 13%. And at the same time, the same period, there was increased profit margins for global brands. So this concept of that we won't do business as usual is kind of a misnomer because business was going on as usual. In fact, the data is kind of shows that business was actually worse than usual post Rana Plaza. So there was very limited, if not very not positive change, and in fact, probably negative change to actual business practices following Rana Plaza, even though there was a lot of attention put towards trying to make significant improvements in the form of monitoring and compliance. So again, to go back to the concept of global supply chains, the idea is what I started the discussion with, the lecture with, is that these kind of characteristics, a lack of information, lack of accountability, a lack of transparency, this hyperflexibility, unequal power dynamics, these characteristics have a direct impact on workers and their lives and livelihoods, leading to health impacts, negative mental and physical health impacts, everyday violence, whether it's some of these are extremely well publicized cases of workers being assaulted or raped or even murdered, but there's also the everyday forms of violence in the form of harassment and just sort of mental anguish that many workers face. And then also the impact on livelihoods. So not looking at things like the low wages that continue, the overtime, the lack of job security. All these have led to very precarious work situations for workers, many workers around the world. So now going to something that we all know and have been living through for the last more than 2 years is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think what many have realized is that in several areas, the COVID-19 pandemic really put a spotlight on what had already existed. So unfair practices and heightened inequality, inequalities that were already there in the system, but the COVID-19 pandemic just sort of put a spotlight, a really sort of focused spotlight on some of these issues. So what we know was that particularly for the garment industry, the global garment industry, COVID-19 was really devastating. So this is from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, where they did a study. This was in March of last year. So they came. The statistics were kind of shocking because they really surveyed. This was kind of all multiple countries, and they found things like 1 in 4 workers did not receive their legally mandated severance pay. Close to 10,000 workers faced what they called wage theft. So they were denied wages that were owed to them. 77% of garment workers had gone hungry since the beginning of the pandemic. Workers' wages, they were 4 times less than what they needed to live on. All this, there was a lot of, sort of quite shocking statistics that were produced during this time, about a year into the pandemic. At the same time, they found that, profits recorded by fashion brands in the second half of 2020, there were $10 billion worth, upwards of profits recorded. So the argument that, yes, I mean, sure, certain brands did struggle during this time, especially at the beginning. But overall, if you look kind of at the balance sheets, many of them actually still continued to do well. But the pandemic was devastating for workers, especially because many global brands just simply canceled orders and refused to take orders that were already produced. So during this time, back in 2020, my center at Berkeley, along, in collaboration with BRAC University in Bangladesh, we did a rapid response survey done by phone, of course, since we could not, interview workers in person. And we tried to just understand how the pandemic was impacting them. And there's a lot of data on this, and I'm happy to share later. I'll put in the chat sort of links to the reports that came out of it. But just very briefly, wanted to show a few different slides, just touching on some of the, to kind of demonstrate the impact that the pandemic had on workers. One, I mean, this was very, not surprising, certainly, but quite striking that, in April of 2020, the monthly salary of workers just it was a huge dip. It was worse for women, female workers versus male workers, but still devastating for male workers. Of course, you have to remember salaries anyway are quite low, and often, it's certainly not a living wage, anywhere close to a living wage. So when these already low salaries fall like this, there's incredible, it's very detrimental for workers and for their livelihoods. We ask questions around savings. Workers typically don't have the ability to save very much at all because, like I said, their wages are so low to begin with, and the expenses are high, inflation is high. They're not able to save. But we asked questions around, during this time, how did workers, what did they do in terms of, if they had to just provide for their family, if they had to buy food. So many, 60% of workers said that they don't save, or they used whatever savings they have to actually just pay for food. And 92% said they had to reduce other expenses during this time. So of course, that really leads to this precarity that workers were facing, whether they, many of them were going hungry, many of them couldn't feed their kids, but it also was a high risk. If anyone had any sort of health problems, there was actually no sort of safety net to fall back on. Personal savings, nor in Bangladesh is one of, many countries really doesn't have a very strong social safety net for workers to fall back on, especially during a crisis like this. We asked a series of questions around mental health, and, again, not surprising. I mean, more than half, 62% responded that they were extremely worried about not being able to feed their family and being worried about, issues of money. Of course, generally we found by gender, this was, again, not surprising, but women tend to face a lot worse mental health issues because, of course, in these scenarios, women are the ones that need to provide for their family. They need to make sure their children are doing okay. Their children need to eat. There's just, and there was a lot of devastating stories at the time. Pregnant women were being fired. Many, they were denied any sort of benefits that the factory owed them, whether it was maternity benefits, any benefits that they were legally entitled to. And this, of course, caused extreme amounts of stress, depression, and anxiety. And then, we interviewed many labor leaders, and one of them in particular is Kalpana Akhtar, who is a labor leader that I've known for many years in Bangladesh, who does wonderful work on the ground. And, in this context of around COVID, she had a great quote, which was really, when people talk about relief, it irritates me. We don't want relief programs. We don't need any training. We just want dignified wages. We just want the laws to be implemented and protect us. And she was basically went on to say, brands can do that by working with our government, and it's really not that hard. And so this kind of gets at the types of programs, the types of interventions that we typically think workers need. If you talk to workers, they actually say, don't give us any other training types of programs. Just give us wages we can live on and some sort of security net, and our lives would be better. So what's important to kind of go back to is, the earlier slides around unequal power dynamics. I mean, obviously this has always been in place. The global supply chain itself is unequal, and that is, again, the nature of the global supply chain in and of itself. And who really has the power in this situation? This was a quote. It's anonymous because I can't name the person, but someone who is the head of labor and human rights at a major retailer was very frank with us and actually said, when we were asking about the cancellations that took place, he said, it's an open secret, frankly, that cancellations, I think, are more common than people think. If a shipment arrives and it doesn't meet any of our quality standards, or if the vendor says, okay, well, the shipment is going to be 3 months late, we and any other company out there retain the right to, for specifically prescribed reasons, to cancel the orders. And that is just how the apparel business works. So he was very frank and open about this. And that just kind of struck me then when we were doing these interviews during COVID, that, this is something that has existed from the beginning. It's just that COVID itself was such a, dramatic situation. It was a global pandemic. The entire world was impacted. When brands, one by one, rapidly started canceling these orders at kind of at one time, then it became very dramatic. And of course, there was a lot of news media coverage around this. But the fact is that this is not something that didn't happen before. And I think who has the power, it's very clear that it's really, the northern retailers tend to always sort of have the power in the relationship with suppliers in the global south. So now I just want to kind of, as thinking about wrapping up before I get to your questions, thinking about, finally, how can we disrupt the power imbalance? And what types of structural changes need to be made? So, there's certainly more, but the three that we see as sort of really important, and I think, again, COVID being sort of an important, possibly a tipping point, a turning point. One is in the area of business model changes. So the idea that what I mentioned earlier, post Rana Plaza, the way business has continued to be done, especially my focus is really on the global garment industry, but I think this is similar for other industries as well. The business model itself has actually contributed to perpetuating poor labor rights in these supply chains. So the fast fashion. This is also the case in the agriculture industry with fast food. The kind of incredible demand for very quick production, but at very low costs. That model really does. I think now it's very clear that leads to a lot of difficulties for workers in the factories themselves, all sorts of abuse. Impacts on their physical and mental health, but also leads to, overtime. And then oftentimes they're not even getting paid the limited wages that they are. Oftentimes the wages are not even paid. So the business model change is one area that we see potentially there is some movement maybe towards some changes in this area. And this is one way certainly that the power imbalance can be disruptive. The other thing is it's sort of, there is some important and exciting movements in terms of legislative changes, really more in Europe, less in the US. I don't see this much happening in the US right now, but in Europe, like recently, there's been a lot of sort of due diligence and disclosure types of legislation that have been enacted, which are really important because that allows for, or it sort of forces, I mean, this is hard law versus, sort of soft, principles. Rather than that, this is hard legislation that actually forces companies and brands and retailers to kind of understand what is happening in their supply chain and actually to make changes. So not just sort of, pushing them to comply in a very sort of, neutral way, but actually forcing them to make significant changes if there are labor abuses in their global supply chains, and actually having some sort of consequences for that. That's really key. And I think the other thing is really, was a learning even for me as I was working on these issues during COVID, the idea of contractual changes. I mean, that's another, I know I'm not a contract lawyer, I don't have the legal expertise, but that's another area where we really see potential for change. Really redesigning the contracts in a way where they're not so skewed. Right now, the way there's all sorts of loopholes really for on the side of global retailers, and they can take advantage of that, which we see that all the time. So just finally, perfect timing. Just to end with this idea that, this is a really critical moment. I think for us to, these are the buzzwords we've been hearing. How do we build back better? What is the new normal? But this is a critical time, I think, to think about, how would we build back better and actually work to create this new normal. So I'll stop there. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Sanchita. That was like you covered a lot of ground in very little time, and moving from the Rana Plaza, and the problems that this sector has. And as you have correctly mentioned, that they've been aggravated by the pandemic or sort of magnified by the pandemic, but they were already there to the extent that the ILO has put the ILO call for action in the global garments industry in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was sort of endorsed by the brands, the manufacturers, the trade union, as well as the ILO, to catalyze action from across the global garment industry to support both the manufacturers as well as the workers in terms of income, health, and employment. And you touched upon the issues of, health and income as well as well-being. But this is a sector that is also typically high in the representation of women compared to other sectors. Like 46% of the workers are women. And you touched upon the dip in the wages, but this dip in the wages is also, historical in the sense that they are normally do not have equal pay, and also, they also tend to be in the low status forms of employment rather than men. So, as you correctly said, this is a sector where those areas have been magnified and amplified, and the ILO initial forecasts for the job losses in this sector were around 73 million jobs. That was a forecast in June 2020. So it is a sector that is suffering from many problems, and it is now the right moment to build back better, as you have correctly mentioned. So in terms of building back better, I'd like to come to something that you wrote earlier in the Made in Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka, where you mentioned the linking of improved labor conditions and workers' empowerment. And if you can talk more about that, and we will be taking also the questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments and feedback. And yes, I went through a lot. I wanted to, keep a sense of time, but it is very interesting in a way that, how these all link together. I mean, I think it's initially, we couldn't have imagined after Rana Plaza, we would, 7-8 years later, have this huge sort of global crisis. But it's interesting and unfortunate, actually, that when the priorities were a certain way, it created a situation, I think, that made it very, the situation for workers became very difficult. I think in hindsight, it's easy now to say if you look back, but I think if there was a focus on other areas beyond just the structure. It could have changed, I think, the way workers, at least in Bangladesh, their impact of COVID. But, there weren't really changes in other areas. So, buildings have become safer, yes, which is, again, crucial. But all these other areas that I mentioned have not changed. So when there was such a global crisis, it was devastating. Yeah, so to answer your question around, so my first book, and I've done some work after that, really looking at this idea that oftentimes I think top-down programs, they tend, and this is not just in with workers' rights. I mean, we see this all the time. I'm thinking in the US, a lot of the social programs that we think, how do you want to help people who are homeless? How do you want to help people who are in poverty? How do you, it's very much becomes top down. And so the sort of the quote unquote experts tend to design these programs, and then they tend to say, okay, this is what we need to do. This is how we're going to implement it. And there's not a lot of, there's very little sort of feedback or involvement of the population themselves, whoever that may be. And in this case, actually the workers, in my work in Bangladesh, where I've seen the most exciting work happening has been really grassroots labor organizing by women. So again, even unions in large parts of Asia, they can be very male dominated, very hierarchical, very political, very brutal. In fact, I mean, for women, it's often not a good option for them to join labor unions. So I've been very encouraged. One of the quotes I had was from a labor leader I haven't mentioned. I've worked with a couple over the years, and there's many others who have just done, fantastic work on the ground. And I think for some of the changes that have been made over the years, I think I think it's to their credit that they've been able to do it. But the irony that has happened is that sometimes these top-down programs, sometimes they're government initiatives, they're private sector initiatives, are really kind of happening at this level. They don't include workers. They sort of come up with all these strategies and trying to make all these, changes at these large scale types of things, but because they don't involve workers. I've seen actually the ironically what tends to happen in two countries I also have worked in, so Sri Lanka and Cambodia. So on one hand, they are known for good labor rights, or at least better. I mean, compared to Bangladesh, they've always been in a better position. But on the other hand, there's extreme repression on workers and organizing. And so Cambodia and Sri Lanka both, I mean, they really have lost a sort of labor movement. Sri Lanka has been squelched really over the decades. Cambodia, there's a lot. I mean, it's quite repressive. At the same time, they're sort of trying to portray that we have good labor rights. And so then it becomes this sort of nuance of labor, good labor conditions versus, promoting good labor rights. The distinction between everyday conditions, which may be better actually in Cambodia, Sri Lanka, yes, I think compared to Bangladesh, certainly. But actually, if you look at the organizing, there's a lot more repression. What's positive, I think, in Bangladesh has really been the organizing. There is government repression, certainly, but I think we've seen a much more engaged and vibrant labor movement in Bangladesh, especially led by women, where in these other two countries, you don't see that in the same way. So it's a bit ironic because that's not the outcome you would expect when you see certain changes happening. But there's clearly a distinction between improving labor conditions and allowing or just promoting labor rights, which is different. The one thing I didn't get a chance to talk to in this talk in particular is, I mean, the other thing, of course, over the decades that we know has gotten worse is the repression on labor. I mean, I think across countries, there's been everything from sort of subtle to full-on violent crackdowns. And this happened in Bangladesh during COVID. Workers were not really out organizing because they couldn't be outside, but there was a lot of repression, even when they were protesting, trying to get their wages or whatever, going back to the factories, a lot of crackdown. So that is actually, even if I look at Rana Plaza, I think some of that has even gotten worse. So these are a lot of areas that still need to be worked on for sure.
Thank you. And I see that we are asking our participants if they have any questions or comments. So please either type them in the chat box or raise your hand. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, so I don't want to dominate the discussion, and I have a lot of questions to ask. Vinette, please go ahead. Vinette Sharma, please.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a wonderful discussion, Sanchita, with brilliant slides, very, very informative. So my basic question is regarding the, you referred about the fast fashion, but what is the role of, government policies in this, because the government policies are very much, favoring this such type of exploiting of labor, through these lower taxes for big, large corporates, some of the luxury brands, which we know about on day-to-day basis, and with that, in fact, absolutely, with that, they basically are supporting, for example, the transfer of labor to the emerging countries where the labor standards are extremely poor, and they are promoting capital, instead of capital and automation instead of labor, where the human conditions and the labor environment is much more better, so once upon a time, nearly around 20 or 30 years back, the lot of these big brands were based in the US and in developed countries. Manufacturing was considered to be a lot more dignified, but today we are finding that manufacturing has been completely being outsourced, and basically through these new business model like contract manufacturing, etc., where the absolute there is this the only thing that is given importance is the stock market, the corporate profits, and the wealth of the promoters, just like big tech. But but at the same time, wages and the human conditions basically are not being given that sort of importance. And even in the business verticals, we are finding that marketing costs are basically so high, that the firms are basically spending billions and billions, not only just in garments but even in the automobiles, etc., even in other sectors, for example, even in this automobiles, or for that matter other areas of technology, etc., they are spending big on marketing, and spending very big on what you call on the just for promoting their what you call their market share, but executive pay, etc., but the as far as the inequality as far as the labor is concerned, that is simply rising day by day, so how can we basically try to bring some kind of make some sense of this, so that because in future we are going to be seeing such type of climate issues also, because of the such type of things, because the lot of this products that are being manufactured of lot of what you call very, very toxic waste, and obviously that will be having very, very damaging consequences for the coming generations. So can you throw some light on this? Thanks.
Thank you. Let's take all the comments and maybe you can reply to all of them together, Sanchita. So let's try to be more efficient with our time. I saw Farida Sergeni.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. It was very informative and very interesting. My question to you would be, we talked a bit about the kind of social media backlash that the company faced after the Bangladesh disaster. And I suppose I wanted to know to what extent is kind of the driving force of this movement or efforts towards improved labor rights, to what extent can it be supported by or changed by people's image of the brand. So I guess another way to phrase it is, to what extent would raising awareness to kind of us, the consumer, the public, about these issues going to result in actual change? Could it actually have a significant impact to like companies' policies changing over time?
Thank you, Farida. And then Lauren Clark.
Hi, I enjoyed the presentation and I really enjoyed the raw honesty about it, especially when you posted the picture about the women who mentioned about, not needing aid or so forth, but just needing a stable system. So my question is this: as we hear more honest dialogues such as these take place around blockchains, are you starting to see people on the ground format their own blockchain systems that are actually adequate and sufficient, not ones that maybe reflect the mainstream or the larger corporations, but those that reflect what they need on the ground level? Therefore, they're kind of, maybe I'm gonna say, cutting through the middleman, but just deciding, well, since these blockchains aren't working, we're gonna create it ourselves. And what models have you found by those particular communities and communities and other smaller on the ground personnel who are using those? Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. And Ali, I see your hand is up as well.
Yes, thank you, Sanchita. I have a comment and a question. The first comment is, I was involved a little bit with the apparel industry in Egypt, and I can tell you, most of the time, there are very few who would do a social audit. Most of them, they do not. The only one that was doing a very extensive audit was actually the US Customs and Border Control, because they want to verify rules of origin, period. The others weren't. So there is no way to do it, especially that most of those guys were doing excessive outsourcing. So it's not like a first tier. It's a second tier, third tier, so they really can bury it in the chain. But this is one comment. Now, the other thing is about the governance. When you talk about the governance, for me, the ILO, Ahmed knows better than me in this, but there is a right to collective bargaining of labor. I'm talking about that they have the right to form like a union. And this is within the company, not at the and in most countries, most developing countries, this is not an observed right. So you could do whatever you want with them. This is one. Now the other side is also the consumer side. We're not doing a good job in forming consumer coalitions that could push for against labor exploitation, against child labor, against etc. etc. I think Europeans are more attuned to this, but even in the US, if you could do something properly, you can sort of promote and show people how the sweatshops are actually operated. I think they will be more willing, instead of buying a jeans for $20, they might be buying it for $30. We allow a little bit more of a slack that goes to the labor. Those are just quickie things. But again, thanks for a very enlightening discussion. Thank you.
So I turn it over to you, Sanchita, to respond to this group of comments.
Yes, and I want to make sure, hopefully I sort of tried to jot down notes, but I'll try to do it. Okay, so the first gentleman, his comment, and yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned from the beginning of the talk, the way we've had, for the last few decades, the way global supply chains, there's a clear sort of economic motivation to create these complex supply chains. That there is definitely this interest of going to, it's low cost, going to countries where it's going to be cheaper. And if you're very cynical, you'll say not only cheaper labor, but rule of law is a little bit, not as strong, or you don't have the kinds of protections, even though these are countries in the West that sort of claim, this is a big claim, people will argue with me, like definitely corporates will say, oh gosh, we never would think something like that. But those who are very cynical say that you're particularly going to countries that where the legal frameworks are weak, that the labor, the last comment, the ILO mandates are not being promoted, they're not being upheld. You kind of know that going in. And so you're not trying to push for changes in them. You're hoping that you can continue the business in a way that's most profitable to you in these conditions. But certainly, I mean, the West has, this is created by Western countries who think that this is going to be more profitable for them. What I feel is encouraging, and that's why I wanted to end the talk with more of a hopeful note, because I do really feel like this moment in time, it's a very unique moment. We never thought we would be in this, something that has impacted really virtually every part of the world. It never kind of happens like that, but it is an important time because we're seeing that I mean, I think it's clear, and to the first gentleman's point about environment also, I mean, that's another whole aspect of this. Not only are we talking about poor labor conditions, I mean, all these sort of ways of doing business are hugely detrimental to the environment. And we know that, I think there's this realization that we cannot continue as we have been. This is not sustainable in any way. Environmentally, labor, I mean, now the big thing is, profit, planet, people. We have to think carefully beyond just profit. And I think that is, to me, exciting, that the fact is that we are finally here. I mean, it took, we've done a lot of damage, and we finally, okay, but at least we can say that. I think even prior to COVID, we're starting to see this, but I think COVID is going to accelerate some of this. Again, the legislative areas, the EU and in Europe, there has been Australia as well. Again, US is lagging in this area, but there is some encouraging sort of pieces of legislation coming out that I think is going to change. You don't see impact immediately. It's not overnight, but I think these are all positive changes that are going to make a difference in terms of the way, in terms of the governance of these supply chains, because again, it's clear this is not sustainable. This is not sustainable in any sort of way. The question around, just briefly, I think he mentioned, the first gentleman, about the fast fashion. I mean, what's interesting is there was a period of time, if you remember, the early part of the pandemic, no one was buying anything. I mean, no one was leaving the house. So there was no reason for any sort of fashion, fast or otherwise, right? So no one was, everyone was sitting in their sweatpants and pajamas. So it is curious to see, and I haven't seen recent data, and very recent data, how as we are sort of getting back to normal, if this has impacted the fast fashion trend, which I've argued in other talks and things, I mean, that's extremely detrimental to labor issues and the environment, both. The fast fashion part of the garment industry is sort of the worst piece of it. And whether that COVID is going to change that, because people did, they had this period of time where, they weren't really buying much, but again, maybe it'll just kind of go back once again. I don't know. That remains to be seen. So, and I guess I'll link also with a couple of comments around consumers. So absolutely, I think, I get this question a lot, especially in my classes. Every young people often want to really know, as a consumer, I mean, what can I do? I would say there have been a lot of interesting and sort of important movements, consumer-based movements. Post Rana Plaza, there was a lot of groups that came out that sort of, around like fast fashion revolution, sort of rethinking fashion, again, addressing the issue of fast fashion. Excuse me. There are groups that actually, sort of rate and rank different retailers. They give them, sort of numbers. They say that this is, based on their studies, this is who is doing better. Again, you can't sort of, there's no, I mean, no one is perfect by any means, but there's certainly retailers that are doing a better job. They're more conscientious versus the really egregious violators who don't seem to care. I mean, there's definitely a difference, Again, consumer impact it takes time. It's not something that will happen overnight, but I think just awareness, and I tell students in my class, for example, if you don't buy fast fashion, if you actually buy clothing and you keep it for some time, you reuse, you buy used clothes, you hand down things. I mean, people used to do that. They would hand down, I've done that with my kids. I have 2 boys, so like they alter their life. Like there were there's a hand-me-down concept, or even with cousins, and these clothes are in perfectly good condition. There's no need to just after a month or so just get rid of it. I mean, there's sort of the I guess this comes into sort of the whole concept of the circular economy. I mean, the sort of the starting from the beginning, but really thinking at every step, and then creating products that are not going to be throwaway, but actually be reused and recycled in some way. So there are things like that I think these are all demanded by consumers, and it's going to be impacted by consumer behavior. And I would encourage all of you to understand that. I will never tell anyone, and I don't believe in sort of boycotting in the sense that, I'm never going to buy from this brand. I mean, those things I don't think help, because ultimately, if you put a brand out of business, I mean, a lot of workers lose their jobs. So that's not, kicking brands out of countries. I was very much against after Rana Plaza when brands started pulling out. I thought that was extremely wrong and short-sighted move, because you've already created these employment opportunities for primarily women, as you said, right? If you suddenly pull out, then what options do they have? So you can't do that, but you need to change the way it's done, given the circumstances. Now it's been 40, 50 years. You can't just suddenly leave. I mean, that I think would be a huge mistake. So that's almost a cop-out. I think of the brands to say, oh, okay, well, there's a disaster happened, we're going to just leave and let you deal with it. Well, you have come into this country, you've benefited from the labor. Now you should do something to actually make a positive change and actually not leave, but improve what's there. So I think that was. I don't know if there's any other kind of comments around that. The question at the end about subcontracting, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's something I talk about. I didn't get a chance to talk about in detail here, but that's a huge problem. I know, South Asia, Middle East, I know it's the subcontracting sector is something that's very hidden. It's not looked at. I showed that one slide about, what a basement, workers in a basement, that's how subcontractors look. It's not official. They're not proper factories. There's all sorts of violations happening, and they're completely out of the realm of any sort of monitoring and oversight. So that's it. Still a huge gap that we have. All these programs are not addressing. A lot of times you don't know, but this is where legislation becomes important. And this is where even the best of brands who will say, no, but we work with our first tier suppliers and they're all compliant and they're very good. Some of this legislation that's coming out is saying, okay, that's not enough. You have to know what goes beyond and further in your supply chain. And this is when rewriting contracts is important to say, you need to disclose and you need to find out if your first tier and second tier suppliers are subcontracting and something happens, you are held liable and you're held responsible. So that's going to change kind of the way the dynamics are set up right now. Because right now, again, it's, first tier, second tier, fine. And then beyond that, you don't know. I mean, Rana Plaza, the garment factories in there were all subcontracting. Everyone acted, and they may genuinely have been surprised when the building collapsed and they were saying, oh, well, my clothes were produced there, but I never authorized this. But that's kind of the reality of how it happens. So yeah, I'll just end there. I know we're sort of running out of time, but.
Well, you have a lot to say. I believe that one webinar is not sufficient for the knowledge you have to share with us. Okay, a quick comment from Akul, please.
Thank you. My question is, what if the focus is also extended to the sensitization of the workers and about their labor rights? And also, how can this be achieved on a wider scale? Because even if we do everything, legislation and whatever, but the workers themselves, they are the ones at stake, are not aware of their rights, and all this can still be exploited. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, as I said earlier, I think what's encouraging, what gives me a lot of hope is like seeing worker-led movements, especially in this industry, female worker-led movements to actually make substantial change. And they've done, so, there's, for example, that quote says, we don't need training. We don't need, I'm not against training in and of itself, because there are really important trainings that need to take place in terms of as you say, understanding what your rights are, what your options are, how you can negotiate. Those things are very important. I think that was getting more at, sort of these generic sort of empowerment trainings that a lot of brands spend a lot of money on, but they don't, they don't really do that much. And it also assumes that women somehow lacking information, but I don't think that's the case. It's the larger structure that's really preventing women from, leading sort of, having decent conditions in the factories. It's not that they're somehow lacking information, or they're unable to do, there's all this training on, good hygiene or good this and good that. I mean, I don't think women are lacking that information. The fact that they can't practice good hygiene, for example, is that they don't get a bathroom break in 10 hours, or the facilities are so terrible that they can't go, use. I mean, there's a lot of structural issues that I think putting the onus on everything on the women themselves is incorrect. But the lot of the training that's happened, that's again led by female, activists and women-centered NGOs, some really amazing work that has been done, and I think that's very exciting. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's another thing where what consumers can do is they can actually support a lot of these, sort of, indigenous sort of grassroots movements that are worker-led in these countries. And again, that's something, you have to know. I got to know this really through my work. It's, in the West, we don't know of many of what's happening. But if you do know, and if you meet labor activists and stuff, supporting them, I think that's another way to really ensure that workers will have decent rights. Yeah.
Thank you, Sanchita, for this. And just on the comment on the situation of workers and the role that the ILO is playing, I just want to come back to that point, that the ILO has the ILO IFC program on better work, which started in Asia, particularly in Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and as well as Jordan. And we have a better work program here in Egypt, which is piloted with 34 companies. So the whole thrust of it is to empower also workers and have those sort of power dynamics put in check in one way or the other. And as a response to that, actually the trade union law has been reformed here in Egypt in 2017, and the new law was issued. So, and the new labor law is about to be issued. So we really hope that those things are part of the Build Back Better that you have mentioned. So I just like to end on this sort of more positive note, and to thank you once more for an insightful webinar, as well as a great discussion from everybody. And I thank all the participants in this webinar, and we really look forward to seeing everybody in the upcoming webinar by the Gerhard Center, a pathway on community science, a pathway for advancing environmental and climate justice. And we'll be having Scobie Wilson as the person leading this webinar, so it is one also not to be missed. I wish you all the best, and hope to see you again, Sanchita, soon.
Thank you so much.